Early morning, December 1943, Willow Run, Michigan. Frost clings to the corrugated steel of a hangar the size of a city block. Inside, 1,000 small hammers strike in rhythm. Sparks dance under the glow of sodium lamps as women in denim overalls tighten rivets on the silver belly of a bomber. A foreman calls out a number, Ship 7842 ready for rollout. And his voice echoes through the cavernous hall. The air smells of oil, aluminum, and hot coffee. Conveyor belts glide slow and steady, carrying wings wider than houses toward daylight doors at the far end. Beyond those doors, snow drifts past the propellers of finished Liberators lined up in rows, too many to count. Pinned to a concrete column is a newspaper clipping. Its headline reads, "German Air Chief laughs at America's plan for 50,000 planes." A grease-stained hand slaps another page over it. A fresh War Department chart. The line already past 100,000-odd engines rumble to life outside. The ground shakes as another bomber begins its first taxi to the runway, proof that laughter no longer matters. The question remains, how did a nation once unprepared for war build an air force the world thought impossible? In the late 1930s, the United States was not a nation of war. Its skies were quiet, its factories busy with refrigerators and cars, not bombers and fighters. The scars of the Great Depression still ached, and isolationist voices filled Congress. America's Army Air Corps, smaller than that of Portugal, owned barely a few hundred modern aircraft, many more obsolete than operational. Across the Atlantic, however, the world was catching fire. Germany had rebuilt an air force from the ruins of Versailles. The Luftwaffe's Stukas screamed across Poland in 1939, and Messerschmitts ruled the skies over France in 1940. By the time London burned under the Blitz, German propaganda radiated confidence. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall of the Luftwaffe, boasted that no nation on earth could match German air power. Least of all the factory dreamers of Detroit. He wasn't entirely wrong, at least not yet. The United States had no standing war economy. Production of a single heavy bomber could take months, each aircraft hand-built like a luxury car. The fragmented network of small aviation companies, Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in Santa Monica, Consolidated in San Diego, could not yet imagine producing aircraft by the tens of thousands. Then came the shock of 1940. France fell. Britain stood alone. Across the ocean, President Franklin D. Roosevelt realized that America's security depended on what it could build, not merely on what it believed. On December 29, 1940, in his fireside chat to the nation, Roosevelt spoke 12 words that would reshape the continent. We must become the great arsenal of democracy. That phrase, part promise, part command, triggered the most dramatic industrial transformation in human history. Within months, government and industry leaders met in Washington to plan for production on a scale never before attempted. Roosevelt's advisors, men like William S. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who had led General Motors, understood what Göring did not, that American industry's genius lay not in any single factory, but in its ability to organize millions. In early 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the British and French purchasing commissions began buying planes in bulk from the United States. Boeing ramped up production of the B-17 Flying Fortress. Consolidated delivered early runs of the B-24 Liberator. North American aviation turned a modest British request into a fighter that would later become the P-51 Mustang. Yet these were still small steps compared to what was coming. Roosevelt announced a target that sounded impossible: 50,000 aircraft a year. The press treated it as political theater. The Axis treated it as fantasy. Göring mocked the idea, claiming Germany could shoot them down faster than America could build them. But in Detroit, Buffalo, Long Beach, and Seattle, machines began to move. Industrial America responded not with disbelief, but with design. The War Department's new procurement offices issued contracts at a pace unseen since the railway age. Tool and die makers retooled overnight. Engineers redrafted blueprints for modular construction. New aluminum mills and machine tool plants rose beside rail yards. By late 1941, production lines were being built faster than airplanes. Henry Ford, who once claimed war is the enemy of progress, reversed course when he saw the scale of the challenge. He promised to mass-produce bombers the way he had built Model Ts. At Willow Run, his engineers drew a plan for a mile-long factory with its own power plant, rail sidings and airfield. It was designed to roll out one complete B-24 every hour. Behind the numbers lay the social revolution that would define the wartime home front. America's workforce changed shape overnight. Housewives, students, and farmers' sons learned to read blueprints. Night schools trained thousands in riveting, welding, and tool calibration. Government posters urged, "Do the job he left behind." Still, in 1941, the dream remained fragile. Isolationists argued that mass production of aircraft would drag the nation into foreign wars. Raw materials were scarce. Skilled labor was limited. Factory managers struggled to coordinate design revisions arriving weekly from the Army Air Forces. Then, on December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Overnight, all argument ended. The United States declared war, and the arsenal of democracy came to life. Across the continent, factory lights burned without pause. Aluminum smelters in Washington roared day and night. At Douglas in California, shifts changed under floodlights at midnight. In Buffalo, Curtiss Wright expanded into new hangars every month. A single directive from the War Production Board ordered the end of all civilian car manufacturing. Detroit's assembly lines would build wings, engines and guns instead. Within months, Ford's Willow Run began its first test runs. Douglas expanded to Chicago, and North American's assembly lines in Inglewood multiplied. The numbers began to climb. Each month's output beat the last. The sound of air drills became the new national anthem, but these were only the foundations. The true test was still ahead. The transformation of America's consumer economy into a relentless war machine that could outproduce every Axis power combined. By mid-1942, America's conversion to total war was no longer a vision. It was an earthquake. Entire industries shed their civilian skin. At the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, where cornfields once met the horizon, a mile-long assembly line now thundered with the sound of 24-hour production. A single bomber began at one end as sheets of aluminum and rolled out the other as a fully armed B-24 Liberator. Ford had done it. Mass production had come to aviation. The automotive giants followed. General Motors created Eastern Aircraft Division to build Navy fighters. Chrysler, once famous for its sedans, turned its immense Dodge Chicago facility into the largest aircraft engine plant in the world, producing thousands of Wright Cyclone engines that powered bombers across every front. Packard licensed Britain's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, its workers crafting the heart that would one day make the P-51 Mustang immortal. The scale defied comprehension. Where Germany dispersed its aircraft workshops in fear of bombing, the United States centralized and multiplied. Assembly halls the size of battleships rose in places that had never seen an airplane. Kansas City, Tulsa, Fort Worth. In California, Douglas, North American, and Lockheed stretched from Santa Monica to Burbank. A chain of light and motion that never slept. Behind those walls, the new American workforce took shape. 5 million women entered heavy industry for the first time. They wore coveralls, tied kerchiefs over their hair, and learned to drill, rivet, and weld with precision once reserved for toolmakers. Their faces filled the posters of the War Manpower Commission. Rosie the Riveter was not a symbol. She was a statistic multiplied by millions. In the foundries of Pittsburgh, men who had once forged steel rails now poured molten aluminum for bomber wings. In the shipyards of Oregon and Washington, thousands of women learned arc welding under the glare of blue flame. African-American workers, long excluded from skilled trades, joined under Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination in defense industries. It wasn't equality yet, but it was entry. By 1943, the American industrial system had become an organism, alive, coordinated, self-correcting. The War Production Board, WPB, under Donald M. Nelson, directed raw materials with military precision. Copper, aluminum, and rubber were rationed and allocated like ammunition. Civilian refrigerators disappeared from stores. Bicycles and typewriters were restricted. The nation's comfort was sacrificed to its capacity. Factories that once made sewing machines now turned out Browning .50 caliber guns. Automobile paint lines switched to olive drab. Conveyor belts that carried refrigerators now carried Pratt & Whitney engines. Even Coca-Cola built mobile bottling plants for the front lines. Its trucks protected under military contract because morale, too, was part of production. Training schools spread across the continent. The Office of Education created emergency programs in machine drafting and metallurgy. In airfields from Texas to Ohio, test pilots climbed into brand-new aircraft built by hands that had never before touched a wing spar. They took off into morning skies, filled with the smell of fuel and fresh paint, and came back to report that the planes worked. Numbers told the story. In 1939, America produced 2,141 military aircraft. By 1941, 433. By the end of 1943, nearly 86,000. And when the year closed on 1944, the figure had crossed 96,000, the milestone that would shatter Göring's laughter. Every bomber, every fighter, every cargo plane represented the synchronized labor of thousands. A B-17 carried 200,000 separate parts. Its creation required the cooperation of 60,000 companies, from tiny screw suppliers in New Jersey to tire makers in Akron, to optics factories in Rochester. This industrial web became the invisible weapon of the Allies. Britain could design, Russia could endure, but only America could manufacture on such a scale. Ship convoys carried the proof across the Atlantic. Crates marked U.S. Army Air Force's property, filled with engines, propellers, and aircraft kits for assembly abroad. Still, it was not without strain. Inflation loomed, strikes flared, and accidents were common. At Willow Run, early defects threatened production goals. Some called the factory Will It Run, yet by 1943, its workers had learned the rhythm. A B-24 now rolled out every 63 minutes, a bomber a day, then a bomber an hour. The Axis dismissed it as propaganda. In Berlin, reports describing American factories working in shifts of 3 were labeled psychological exaggeration. But reconnaissance photos over Seattle and Los Angeles told another story. Endless roofs, endless rail sidings, endless airframes parked wingtip to wingtip. By 1944, the United States had achieved not just industrial strength but industrial supremacy. German intelligence reports, once mocking, now warned that enemy aircraft appear in numbers previously unimaginable. Yet the heart of this transformation was human. Behind each machine was a worker who had given up comfort for continuity. They worked through blackouts, rationing, and exhaustion. Their paychecks were modest, their shifts long, but their output changed history. From those foundries and assembly lines, America would soon launch not only aircraft, but the decisive air offensives that would crush the Luftwaffe, paralyze Axis logistics, and turn the tide of the war. And with that, the camera lifts from the glowing wings of bombers on American soil to the cold grey skies of Europe, where those machines would soon be tested. The human angle, hands that built the sky. Every war is fought by soldiers, but this one was also fought by hands, blistered, calloused, and determined. In every corner of the United States, ordinary citizens became artisans of flight. Teenagers who had never seen an airplane learned to polish aluminum to mirror shine. Housewives who once sewed dresses now stitched parachutes. A steelworker's daughter from Ohio could drill 1,000 rivet holes a day and still smile for the photographer who called her Rosie. Inside the plants, the air vibrated with rhythm. The clang of pneumatic hammers and the thrum of engines on test stands merged into an industrial symphony. Posters reminded workers that each misaligned bolt could cost a pilot's life. It wasn't abstract. Most families had a son, husband, or brother overseas. One rivet at a time, they were building his wings. Wages were modest, but pride was infinite. Women lined up at cafeterias with tool belts still on their hips. They traded stories of long shifts, missed holidays, the smell of metal in their hair. Across the loudspeaker came production numbers: Liberator 21472, Mustang 7003. Cheers would rise, not for competition but for contribution. At the day's end, the plant whistle blew, not to dismiss, but to rotate. Another shift arrived, faces tired yet eager. The war never slept, and neither did they. Those workers would never fire a gun or drop a bomb. But each hour they labored meant another crew in the air, another mission completed, another chance that freedom would endure. Their battlefield was the factory floor, their weapon the wrench, their victory the sound of engines over Europe. The technological angle, the invention of mass flight. Before the war, an airplane was almost an artwork. Built by hand, inspected by eye, and fitted by craftsmen, it was precise but slow. The war demanded something new, an airplane not as a masterpiece, but as a product of pure engineering logic. At Douglas and Boeing, engineers turned art into arithmetic. They broke airframes into sub-assemblies: nose, fuselage, wings, tail. Jigs and fixtures held each piece so precisely that parts from California could fit perfectly with parts from Kansas. The innovation wasn't only mechanical, it was procedural. Moving assembly lines revolutionized production. At Willow Run, the B-24 Liberator moved forward as components were added in sequence, from the bare skeleton to a living, roaring machine. Conveyor belts delivered engines, hydraulics, and armament in a dance of coordination. In a single day, one plant could assemble more tonnage of aircraft than all of Germany's manufacturers combined. The science of tolerance and standardization became an American weapon. Bolts, bearings, and valves were manufactured to identical specifications nationwide. If a part broke in combat, it could be replaced from any supply depot in the world. Material shortages drove new inventions. Aluminum alloys grew stronger. Plexiglass replaced heavy glass in canopies, and self-sealing fuel tanks saved pilots from fire. At the same time, aircraft evolved rapidly, from early P-40s to long-range P-51 Mustangs. From the modest B-17 to the massive B-29 Superfortress, each improvement shortened the war. The B-29 alone contained 55,000 separate drawings and required 500,000 parts, yet it could be assembled faster each month. That efficiency was the miracle Göring never foresaw. Not only could America build, it could improve while building. Factories became laboratories of perpetual innovation. Mistakes were dissected overnight. If a component failed in the field, the data traveled back through the supply chain in days. The loop between combat and production was shorter than any in history. By 1944, American industry wasn't just making planes. It was evolving them faster than the enemy could respond. The leadership angle, commanders of steel and time war, is often defined by generals: Eisenhower, Patton, Rommel. But in the arsenal of democracy, the commanders wore factory dust instead of medals. Men like William S. Knudsen and Donald M. Nelson, both veterans of Detroit's automobile empire, became the generals of production. Knudsen, drafted directly from General Motors by Roosevelt himself, organized manufacturers the way an officer would deploy divisions. His philosophy was simple: no one builds alone. He created a hierarchy where thousands of companies functioned like regiments. Parts suppliers, subcontractors, transporters, all synchronized under one command structure. Nelson, leading the War Production Board, enforced priorities with near-military authority. Factories that missed quotas received direct intervention. Materials were rationed not by profit but by necessity. An aircraft's engine received metal before a civilian stove did. The genius of leadership lay not only in scale, but in trust. Roosevelt delegated production to industrial experts, a rare political humility. He understood that to fight an industrial war, America had to let its manufacturers lead the charge. On the ground, plant managers became field officers. They planned shifts like campaigns, balancing manpower, fatigue, and morale. Their daily reports read like battle summaries. Target 150 fuselages, achieved 162. Casualties 3 injuries, 0 defects. At night, lights across the country burned like stars. Executives who once competed for market share now competed for output speed. A private rivalry turned into a patriotic race. It was leadership without uniforms. Yet it produced victories counted not in territories gained, but in machines delivered. By 1943, Roosevelt's impossible promise of 50,000 aircraft had already been surpassed. The command of steel and time had won its first war, the war of production, and while America built, the Axis watched, still convinced that numbers alone could not win a war. They were about to be proven devastatingly wrong. The enemy's miscalculation, the laugh that echoed too long. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe's confidence bordered on arrogance. When President Roosevelt announced that America would build 50,000 planes, Hermann Göring reportedly laughed and called it a fantasy of shopkeepers. In his eyes, the United States was a country of consumers, not soldiers, of assembly lines for cars and washing machines, not war machines. The Reich's intelligence assessments reinforced that illusion. German analysts measured American aircraft output from the mid-1930s, a few thousand planes per year, many obsolete. They calculated that even tripling production could not rival the Luftwaffe's established base. What they did not see was the storm brewing beneath the surface, the industrial culture that had mastered interchangeability, logistics, and mass delivery. German production remained bound by old traditions. Aircraft were built in small workshops with hand-fitted parts and limited standardization. Every Messerschmitt required the careful labor of craftsmen. Every Focke-Wulf wing had its own set of jigs. It was quality without quantity. In contrast, American factories embraced the opposite truth. Quantity could create its own quality. The more they built, the better they became at building. By 1943, German reconnaissance pilots reported endless grids of American airfields in England, new squadrons arriving faster than they could be counted. Commanders dismissed the reports as exaggeration until the evidence became undeniable. The laughter stopped when thousands of silver bombers filled the European sky at once, and the Luftwaffe, once supreme, realized that every destroyed aircraft would be replaced in days. What Göring never understood was that America's real weapon wasn't steel or fuel, it was organization. The tactical and operational angle, the air that belonged to no one. Air power in war is measured not by invention alone, but by replacement. Each fighter shot down, each bomber lost over enemy territory, demanded immediate replenishment. Germany's aircraft factories, scattered and fragmented by Allied bombing, could not replace losses quickly enough. America's could and did. The Allied strategy hinged on that reality. In 1943, the combined bomber offensive took shape. A relentless daylight campaign by the US 8th Air Force and nightly raids by the Royal Air Force. The goal was not just to bomb cities, but to destroy the enemy's ability to make aircraft, fuel, and ball bearings, the sinews of war. Production made strategy possible. Without thousands of bombers and fighters arriving every month, those missions would have been suicide. But America's factories delivered. B-17 flying fortresses rolling off Boeing lines in Seattle, B-24 Liberators from Ford's Willow Run, and P-47 Thunderbolts from Republic Aviation. Each model improved, each iteration tougher than the last. By late 1943, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, gave Allied bombers something they had never had before: long-range escort. Now the Luftwaffe could be met, fought and beaten over its own homeland. Every sortie was an equation of industry. Behind each bomber formation, there were rivers of fuel, mountains of ammunition, and convoys of spare parts, all shipped, catalogued, and distributed by the same system that had once delivered peacetime goods across America. Tactically, production created tempo. It allowed commanders to attack every day, without pause for recovery. It enabled simultaneous theaters: Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, all supplied from the same reservoir. For the pilots, this meant confidence. When they strapped into a cockpit, they knew replacements were waiting. For the enemy, it meant despair. A Luftwaffe pilot might survive 10 sorties and return to an airfield lined with empty hangars. His losses were permanent. His opponents were not. Industrial might had turned into operational endurance, a weapon of time. The moral and strategic angle. The price of power. The triumph of production carried its own shadow. The same factories that forged victory also erased limits. When resources became infinite, destruction did too. Strategic bombing, born from the promise of air supremacy, evolved into a philosophy of annihilation. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden became targets as much for morale as for military value. Inside America, few doubted the necessity. The war had to end, and ending it required pressure the enemy could not withstand. Yet some voices, journalists, clergy, even factory workers, began to ask, at what point does power become punishment? The War Department answered not in words, but in numbers. Every aircraft, every bomb, every engine was a means to shorten the war. The quicker the output, the quicker the end. And for those on the assembly lines, that arithmetic was unassailable. Their brothers, husbands, and sons were flying those missions. To slow production felt like betrayal. Morally, it was the paradox of total war. The same humanity that built hospitals and schools could also construct machines for destruction, and do both with the same precision. Strategically, however, it worked. By 1944, Allied command believed air power alone could break the enemy's spine. The invasion of Normandy would never have been possible without the preceding year's destruction of the Luftwaffe and its industries. The sky over France on June 6, 1944 was not empty. It was owned. When thousands of Allied aircraft covered the beaches, the lesson became clear. Industry had become strategy. The factory floor was as decisive as the battlefield. By the close of 1943, the arsenal of democracy had reached its full stride. America was producing aircraft faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. The once impossible target of 50,000 was not just surpassed, it was doubled, and as those wings filled the sky, the story moved toward its decisive moment, when production would translate into absolute control of the air. Big Week. The sky turns American. February 20th, 1944. The morning over northern Germany was slate grey, a curtain of cloud laced with ice crystals. From England came the distant thunder of engines, not dozens but hundreds, then thousands. It was Operation Argument, better known to history as Big Week. For the first time, the United States Army Air Forces launched a coordinated, sustained assault on the heart of the German aircraft industry. The factories at Leipzig, Gotha, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Augsburg. The objective was not merely to bomb, but to cripple. Wave after wave of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators crossed the channel in disciplined formations, each one born from the factories that had once been dismissed as impossible dreams. From 25,000 feet, the contrails merged into a single white canopy stretching from horizon to horizon. Below, German radar screens lit up like constellations. Alarms screamed across the Reich. Pilots scrambled from their airfields, engines coughing black smoke into the freezing dawn. The Luftwaffe was ready. But what it faced that week was something no nation had ever confronted before. An enemy that could replace every loss almost instantly. As the first bombers reached the target zones, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dived through the clouds. Air combat erupted in sheets of tracer fire. The Americans paid dearly. Bombers fell flaming through overcast skies, their crews parachuting into enemy fields. Entire squadrons vanished in smoke, but the formations did not turn back. There were always more planes behind them. For 7 consecutive days, the onslaught continued. Factories that had once assembled the pride of the Luftwaffe, the Bf-109 and Fw-190, now lay under clouds of smoke and fire. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt were hit again and again, their output reduced to a fraction of capacity. Machine tool works in Leipzig and Stuttgart burned for days. By the time Big Week ended on February 25th, over 3,500 American bombers and 3,000 fighters had taken part in the raids. More than 350 bombers were lost, but within a month, replacements were already rolling off the lines at Willow Run, Fort Worth, and Seattle. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, had lost over 600 aircraft, including many of its most experienced pilots. Those men could not be replaced. The difference between the two sides was no longer bravery or tactics. It was production. Every German pilot shot down meant years of lost training. Every American plane lost meant a new one arriving by ship or convoy within weeks. The balance of the air war shifted irreversibly during those 7 days. The turning of the tide by March 1944. The U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces could send bomber streams deeper into Germany than ever before. The newly introduced P-51 Mustang, with its Packard-built Merlin engine, finally gave them the long-range escort that commanders had dreamed of. The Mustang could fly to Berlin and back, defending bombers for the entire journey. Its impact was immediate and devastating. German interceptors that once attacked with impunity were now met and destroyed over their own runways. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, found itself under constant assault, in the air, on the ground, and even during takeoff. The Mustang was more than a plane. It was a symbol of industrial synchronization. Designed by North American Aviation, powered by an engine built under British license in American factories, armed with machine guns made in New England, and guided by radios from Chicago, it embodied the entire transcontinental machine that Göring had once laughed at. As the skies turned in the Allies' favor, air superiority began to erode the enemy's entire strategic foundation. The German war machine depended on fuel, and fuel depended on refineries. In the summer of 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces targeted synthetic oil plants at Ploiești, Merseburg and Luna, cutting deep into Germany's reserves. Without fuel, the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft sat motionless on their runways. Training flights were cancelled. Missions were limited. By autumn, even experienced pilots were being held back to conserve fuel. And yet, American production didn't slow. Factories continued to operate at record speed. New bomber models rolled out. The B-29 Superfortress, though designed for the Pacific, represented the zenith of industrial coordination. Its pressurized cabin, remote gun turrets, and advanced radar systems made it the most complex aircraft ever built. For the Axis, each new type was a nightmare. For America, it was Tuesday, the moment of realization, when Allied reconnaissance photos returned from Germany in mid-1944, the evidence was conclusive. Entire aircraft plants had vanished. Assembly halls at Regensburg were flattened, runways were cratered, and what remained of the Luftwaffe was being hunted down by an air force that seemed infinite. German officers began to admit the truth in their own reports. One Luftwaffe field commander wrote bitterly, "Every aircraft we destroy, they replace with 2. Every pilot we lose, they replace with 10. In less than 3 years, the United States had created an aerial armada larger than the rest of the world combined. The impossible 50,000 plane goal had not only been reached, it had been doubled, and with the skies turning American, the ground invasion of Europe could finally begin." The victory of production was about to enable the victory of liberation. The next chapter of this story begins on the beaches of Normandy, where those bombers and fighters, forged in sweat and steel, would pave the way for history's greatest invasion. The summer of 1944, when the sky fell on the Reich June 6, 1944. Dawn over Normandy was pale and cold, the sea churning with grey foam. Beneath that sky sailed 5,000 ships, and above it roared 11,000 aircraft. Every one of those planes, from the smallest liaison craft to the heavy bombers shadowing the beaches, existed because a distant factory worker in Detroit, Wichita or Long Beach had met their quota. By D-Day, the Allied air forces had achieved what once seemed inconceivable: total air supremacy. The Luftwaffe could barely field 300 operational fighters over France. Many never left the ground. American and British bombers struck bridges, rail lines, fuel depots, and command posts with surgical regularity. Fighter bombers strafed roads so relentlessly that German divisions could move only by night. The tide had turned completely. The great invasion succeeded not just because of courage on the beaches, but because the air above them was free. That freedom was forged on the assembly lines. Each Thunderbolt, each Mustang, each Lightning overhead carried within it the signatures of thousands: the riveter from Buffalo, the machinist from Dallas, the welder from Seattle. What began as Roosevelt's 1940 promise of 50,000 planes had grown into a thunderous chorus of engines. More than 100,000 aircraft built by 1944. Alone across the Reich, the Luftwaffe bled itself dry. The attrition curve became a cliff. Between January and July 1944, Germany lost more than 11,000 aircraft. Their replacement capacity collapsed under Allied bombing. By autumn, the once feared fighter arm was shattered beyond repair. Collapse of the Luftwaffe. The war of exhaustion. What broke the Luftwaffe was not a single defeat, but the weight of arithmetic. Germany's entire industrial output in 1944 amounted to barely a quarter of America's. Even when Albert Speer, the Reich's armaments minister, streamlined production, the raw imbalance was immovable. Germany could produce roughly 3,000 planes a month at its peak. The United States, more than 8,000. Fuel shortages compounded the crisis. The destruction of synthetic oil plants meant even surviving aircraft could not fly. Pilots trained for years were grounded. Engines sat idle. Some airfields were overrun with planes that had never flown a sortie. Meanwhile, American assembly lines refused to slow. Even as victory approached, output remained at full throttle. Bombers, fighters, transports, gliders. Factories ran 3 shifts, and women who had learned the trade now trained new recruits. The result was visible in the sky. By the last months of 1944, Allied formations stretched from horizon to horizon. They no longer attacked specific factories. They attacked the concept of German production itself. Locomotives, bridges, oil trains, and marshalling yards burned day after day. Germany's once efficient logistics system crumbled into dust and smoke. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Luftwaffe was a memory. Göring, once so proud, now traveled in armored trains to avoid Allied strafing. His air empire existed only on paper. Industrial thunder, the 100,000 plane milestone, the number itself became symbolic. 100,000 aircraft built. It was not a single year's total, but the culmination of a dream once ridiculed. When Roosevelt's administration first declared it, few engineers believed it could be done. Yet by the close of 1944, the United States had manufactured 96 318 aircraft that year alone, and more than 300,000 since the start of the war. Every one of those machines represented coordination on a continental scale. Raw bauxite mined in Arkansas, aluminum refined in Washington, engines forged in Michigan, wings assembled in California, and the finished product flown to England or the Pacific. Each step was a victory of logistics as much as labor. Trains and ships became arteries of war. Warehouses across the nation stacked engines like cordwood, waiting for wings that had yet to arrive. The efficiency bordered on surreal. an ecosystem of motion that no dictatorship could replicate. And within that system lay something deeper, democracy at work. There were no forced laborers, no slave workshops, no secret police overseeing the assembly lines. There was instead a shared belief that the war could be ended by work. Göring's laughter had turned into silence, drowned by the roar of engines that no fortress could ignore. A new kind of power. By early 1945, Allied bombers could reach any target in Europe at will. Cities like Dresden, Munich, and Berlin were devastated not just by bombs, but by the cumulative effect of industrial warfare, radar, weather forecasting, target analysis, formation tactics, and above all, unlimited supply. The skies over Germany were no longer battlefields. They were highways. American planes escorted convoys, scouted enemy retreats, and dropped food to liberated towns. The instruments of destruction had become tools of rescue, yet the cost was immense. Tens of thousands of airmen had died to secure that supremacy. Each bomber that fell carried 10 men. Each mission that failed meant families waiting for letters that would never come. But those losses were endured and replaced by the same machine that never stopped building. In March 1945, as Allied troops crossed the Rhine and Berlin lay within reach, one truth was undeniable. The war had been won as much in the factories as in the fields. The arsenal of democracy had done more than outbuild its enemies. It had redefined what industrial civilization could do when fully awakened. The air now belonged to no nation. It belonged to the age of mass production, counting the sky, the war's final ledger by the time the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the numbers told their own epic. The United States had produced more aircraft than all Axis powers combined. Over 300,000 planes of every type, bombers, fighters, transports, trainers, and gliders. Behind that staggering figure were 2 million workers, tens of thousands of subcontractors, and 5 years of uninterrupted effort. What had begun as Roosevelt's dream of 50,000 planes had grown into a machine so vast it defied imagination. Factories no longer measured output by single units, but by hourly completion rates. A bomber every hour, a fighter every 20 minutes, an engine every 5. The logistical web that sustained it was equally monumental. Aluminum output rose from £600 million in 1939 to over £4 billion by 1944. Rubber and copper production tripled. Railways and shipping networks were re-engineered to move supplies at wartime tempo. What once took weeks now moved in days. On every continent, American aircraft dominated the skies. Over Europe, B-17s and P-51s patrolled freely. Over the Pacific, B-29 superfortresses turned the tide of Japan's resistance. From the jungles of Burma to the deserts of North Africa, the drone of American engines became the sound of liberation and of inevitability. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Its last sorties were desperate, scattered, and suicidal. In February 1945, German ace Adolf Galland described his units as flying on memory. Pilots took off with only minutes of fuel, hoping to find targets before being forced to glide home. When Germany finally surrendered, Allied intelligence officers toured the ruins of its aircraft industry. They found broken jigs, melted presses, and hangars filled with unfinished fuselages. One officer wrote in his report, "The air war was not lost in the sky, but on the factory floor." That was the quiet truth, a war of capacity, not courage. The global shift. Industry as the new weapon victory did not end the machine. It redefined it. In the summer of 1945, as bombers were still rolling off production lines, contracts were cancelled almost overnight. The same workers who had lived by quotas now faced silence. The War Production Board ordered the shutdown of many plants. Ford's Willow Run, once a city of noise, fell still. Rows of completed bombers stood on tarmac fields with nowhere to go. But America's industrial awakening could not be reversed. The techniques that had built bombers now turned to peacetime prosperity. Tooling lines shifted from wings to washing machines, from fuselages to refrigerators. The same logistical networks that had delivered engines to Europe now delivered automobiles to every state. The GI Bill, signed in 1944, sent millions of returning servicemen to college, fueling a generation of engineers and scientists. Many of them had worked or trained in wartime factories. Their experience with precision manufacturing became the backbone of post-war America. The aerospace industry, commercial aviation, and the rise of jet travel. Even abroad, the ripple spread. British and Soviet planners studied the American production model with astonishment. It wasn't just the number of planes, it was the method, the standardization, the interlocking subcontractors, the worker training programs. The Cold War that followed would be built on lessons first learned in the aircraft plants of the 1940s. Meanwhile, Germany, in ruins, would rebuild its industry from scratch. Japan, devastated by the same kind of air campaigns it once dismissed, would later rise to adopt the very mass production systems that defeated it. The air war had ended, but the industrial race had only just begun. From the ashes of total war, the world had entered a new era, one where factories, not fortresses, would decide the fate of nations. And in the quiet months after VE Day, when the last B-24 rolled off the line and the final rivet gun fell silent, the men and women who had built America's wings looked up once more at the empty sky and wondered what their hands would build next. From war machine to peace engine. Year was 1945. The fires of war had dimmed, but the furnaces of industry still glowed. America stood unmatched, its cities intact, its factories humming, its workforce trained and tested by necessity. No other nation emerged from the war with such capacity or such confidence. Yet victory brought its own reckoning. What do you do with an army of machines when there are no more battles to fight? Across the country, production lines slowed. Government contracts vanished. Thousands of workers, many of them women, faced layoffs as plants retooled for peacetime goods. The transition was jarring. Rosie the Riveter, symbol of wartime might, hung up her gloves as veterans returned home to reclaim factory floors. But her legacy remained, proof that skill, endurance, and discipline were not confined to any gender. Many wartime factories were quickly repurposed. Douglas and Lockheed turned to designing commercial airliners. North American aviation began work on new jet prototypes, laying the foundation for the Cold War air age. Ford's Willow Run, once the temple of bomber production, became a center for automobile manufacturing once again. The industrial muscle that had built 100,000 planes now built a new world, one defined by abundance, mobility and possibility. The global ripple, the Allied victory was not simply military, it was economic and ideological. It proved that a free society, when mobilized and organized, could outproduce and outlast totalitarian regimes built on coercion. Germany's slave labor camps and Japan's militarized industries could not match the output of free workers motivated by purpose, not fear. The arsenal of democracy had done more than win a war. It had established a blueprint for deterrence. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union watched with both awe and apprehension as the American industrial machine turned its focus to peacetime research. Jet propulsion, nuclear energy, electronics, and rocketry. The Cold War would be fought not just with weapons, but with production philosophies. Where the Axis had relied on ideology, America had relied on process, planning, precision, and participation. And those processes would now feed a new contest, the race to dominate the future. Air power had rewritten warfare. Now it would rewrite civilization. Air transport shrank the world. The same engineers who built bombers now designed airliners that could cross oceans in hours. Pilots who once flew missions to Berlin now carried passengers to London and Paris. Radar, jet engines, pressurized cabins, all wartime innovations, became the bones of a new global age. Even consumer culture transformed. The same assembly line logic that produced airplanes now delivered affordable cars, appliances, and homes. Mass production had become part of daily life. The skills that won the war were now powering prosperity, memory of power in the years that followed. Historians would try to measure the miracle, to quantify how a nation so unprepared for war had mobilized to such heights. The figures still stagger the imagination. Billion rounds of ammunition, T-4000 aircraft engines in 1 year. Over 90% of all Allied aviation gasoline refined in the United States. But beyond the statistics was something deeper, a collective understanding that democracy, when pushed to its limits, could summon a force as disciplined and unified as any empire in history. When journalists visited Hermann Göring's cell at Nuremberg, they found the former Reichsmarschall bitter and disbelieving. He had once laughed at the idea that a nation of merchants could master war. Now he was watching the sunset through prison bars, while that same nation was launching its first atomic-powered aircraft projects. The irony was complete. By 1945, the laughter had turned to silence, and that silence became the sound of engines idling on empty airfields, waiting for their next purpose. The arsenal of democracy had not just built airplanes. It had built momentum, the perpetual motion of invention. Factories that once forged destruction now created the framework of peace. And somewhere in the empty halls of Willow Run, a single word remained painted on a wall, fading but legible under the dust. Impossible. It was the word America had erased. The sound that never fades. Dawn again. The factory is quiet now, a cathedral of steel and shadow. Dust hangs where rivet smoke once danced. The floor is empty, except for faint tire marks leading toward a great open door. Through that doorway, sunlight spills across a cracked concrete ramp where bombers once rolled toward the sky. It's hard to imagine the noise that once lived here, the thunder of engines, the roar of compressors, the heartbeat of a nation at full throttle. But if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear it. Between 1940 and 1945, America learned something the world had never seen before, that freedom, when organized, can outbuild tyranny. That democracy, though slow to wake, becomes unstoppable once in motion. The arsenal of democracy wasn't merely an industrial triumph, it was a moral one. It proved that ordinary citizens, working with purpose and faith, could bend metal and time to will. It proved that courage doesn't always carry a rifle. Sometimes it carries a wrench or a clipboard or a rivet gun. The real miracle was not 100,000 airplanes. It was the transformation of an entire society, the realization that power and conscience could coexist in the same engine. And when the war ended, those engines did not fall silent forever. Their spirit lived on, in every factory that retooled for peace, in every airport that carried civilians instead of soldiers, in every nation that looked to the United States and saw what organization, freedom, and belief could create together. The story that began with laughter ended in awe. Hermann Göring's sneer had become an echo, swallowed by the roar of 100,000 wings. History remembers the heroes who flew, but it also remembers the hands that built the sky. The tally boards are gone, the posters faded, but the lesson remains etched in steel. When a free people decide that nothing is impossible, the world changes.